Welcome back to the deep dive. If you want a shortcut to being well-informed, you are absolutely in the right place.
Today we're undertaking something pretty ambitious.
We're trying to cut through, what, a century and a half of skewed history, myths, outright slander, to really explore a figure whose true significance is, I think, only now being fully appreciated, Ulysses S. Grant.
That's absolutely right. I mean, for so long, the narrative around Grant has been just dominated by these two simple and often contradictory caricatures. You have the
Wow.
quiet, sometimes seen as this unskilled cigar-chomping general who just kind of happened to win the Civil War.
And on the other hand, the supposedly naive, corruptible president who just got steamrolled by a tumultuous era.
And if you stop there, you miss everything. You miss the man of profound contradiction.
Yeah, we have stacks of sources here detailing the unexpected depth of his moral compass, his innate military genius, and critically, his record as arguably the most forceful and effective civil rights executive the country had seen up to that point.
So our mission today is really to replace those caricatures with a complex chronological portrait. We need to analyze the key phases of his life, the failures, the military innovations, the moments of political courage.
All of it. To understand how he went from literally selling firewood on a street corner to crushing white supremacist terrorism from the Oval Office, it's an incredible arc.
It is. We're focusing on four key themes.
Yeah.
His sort of radical modern approach to military strategy.
Okay.
His principled commitment to civil rights during Reconstruction.
Which is huge and often overlooked.
Huge. Then there's the intense tension between his personal integrity and the administrative scandals that really defined his presidency.
Right, the stuff that gets remembered. And finally, the incredible dramatic evolution of his historical reputation right up to today.
Which all culminates in our central question for this deep dive. Why did this man, who was celebrated in death as this powerful symbol of unity, spend a century marginalized by historians, often overshadowed by the very people he defeated?
And what does his dramatic resurgence now tell us about which leaders we value in American history?
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start before he was Grant the General, when he was just Hiram Ulysses Grant, born in Ohio in 1822.
And the first step in understanding Grant is really understanding his name, which is itself an accident of history. He was born Hiram Ulysses Grant.
Hiram, yeah.
But when he went to West Point in 1839, his nomination from Representative Thomas L. Hamer mistakenly listed him as U.S. Grant.
And he kept it, which is the truly great historical twist. The sources suggest a couple of reasons for this. First, correcting military records was a bureaucratic nightmare he just didn't want to deal with.
Sure.
But the reason that makes him so relatable, he inverted his first and middle names to avoid the initials HUG on his trunk.
Oh, wow.
Can you imagine carrying a bag labeled HUG around a military academy in 1839? He chose U.S. to avoid ridicule, and that's what gave him the nickname Sam, Uncle Sam, among his fellow cadets.
That's a great detail. And it speaks to a kind of deep personal reserve, a desire to avoid attention, which really marked him his entire life.
It did.
And despite this reserved nature and his initial dislike for military life, he did have one undeniable, almost legendary skill.
Horsemanship.
Horsemanship.
Right.
He wasn't top of his class. He graduated 21st out of 39. But he was known as the most proficient horseman at West Point.
He set a high jump record on his horse, York, that allegedly stood for 25 years, which is just deeply ironic because upon graduation, he was assigned to the 4th Infantry Regiment.
So he walked.
He walked instead of riding in the cavalry.
Exactly.
We also see the roots of his sort of independent moral and spiritual character during this period. He was raised Methodist, but he wasn't outwardly religious. He prayed privately, never formally joined any denomination.
His son later noted that he appeared to be agnostic, suggesting he was a deeply private man who looked inward for moral direction rather than following some external dogma. And before the Civil War, the greatest professional influence on him was definitely the Mexican-American War. He served from 1846 to 1848.
He saw significant combat, notably at the Battle of Palo Alto, and he earned 2 brevet promotions for bravery, including captain.
There's one anecdote from the Battle of San Cosme that just perfectly illustrates his blend of resourcefulness and bravery. When Mexican troops pinned down his unit, he ordered his men to disassemble a mountain howitzer.
A howitzer, wow.
Drag the pieces into a nearby church steeple, reassemble it under fire, and then bombard the Mexican positions from above.
I mean, that kind of unorthodox problem-solving initiative was a preview of his Civil War genius, right?
Totally. But the truly crucial insight we draw from this time wasn't his combat prowess. It was his experience as assistant quartermaster.
Which was not a glamorous job. We're talking logistics, supply chains, provisioning, the deeply unsexy work of moving an army.
Exactly. And Grant initially disliked the role, but the sources are unanimous. This was a transformative education for him.
He learned firsthand the critical infrastructure required to sustain a large mobile force operating deep behind enemy lines. He realized a war could be won or lost, not by the man firing the cannon,
But by the man ensuring the cannonball got there, along with the food and the feed and the medical supplies.
That's the moment he becomes the systems thinker of the Civil War. But personally, that war scarred him deeply.
Yeah.
He wrote later that the Mexican War was morally unjust, designed solely to expand slavery, and that the Civil War was, in his words, divine punishment visited upon the U.S. for its aggression against Mexico.
And that moral grounding would later define his presidency. It's a key part of his character.
Absolutely. And that moral compass was tested almost immediately after the war. From 1854 to 1861, we see this period that historians call his low point, 7 years of absolute financial and professional failure.
He resigned his commission in 1854, effective July 31st. The official record cited drinking, though historians still debate how frequent and severe the issue really was.
Grant himself admitted that the vice of intemperance had not a little to do with my decision to resign. He was basically given a choice: resign or face a court-martial.
And the years that followed were just brutal. He failed at farming on land he called hardscrabble. He tried real estate. The Panic of 1857 hit, and he was so poor he had to sell his gold watch just to buy Christmas gifts for his kids.
And famously, he was reduced to selling firewood on St. Louis street corners. This juxtaposition is just stunning.
It is.
The man who would one day command a million-man army was, just a few years earlier, failing spectacularly as a civilian, completely dependent on his wife's family to survive. This profound failure just gives his later success an even sharper edge.
It does. And in the midst of this failure, we see another critical moral decision, this time regarding slavery. Now, Grant disliked the institution, but he wasn't an abolitionist.
Right.
When he lived in St. Louis, his wife Julia's family, the Dent family, they owned slaves. And in 1858, Grant acquired a slave, a man named William Jones, from his father-in-law, possibly to settle a debt.
But here's the kicker, and this is a highly specific, deeply significant detail. In March 1859, Grant legally freed William Jones via a manumission deed.
Think about the financial reality of that choice. Grant was selling firewood to survive. William Jones was a man worth at least $1,000 at the time.
Which is comparable to, what, $35,000 in today's money?
Something like that. I mean, this was an enormous asset he desperately needed, yet he chose to free him, writing later that he simply couldn't bring himself to hold an enslaved person against his will.
It's a powerful testament to his personal moral code that exists entirely outside of any political expediency.
Totally.
By 1860, he finally finds some stability. He moves his family to Galena, Illinois, to work in his father's leather goods business, Grant and Perkins. He's paying off debts, stabilizing his family, finally establishing himself as a reputable citizen, just as the Union begins to collapse.
So the war really saved him from civilian obscurity.
You could say that, but in retrospect, maybe he also saved the war.
So the Civil War starts, and Grant's commitment is immediate and absolute. On April 21st, 1861, he famously wrote, "We have a government and laws and a flag, and they must all be sustained. There are but two parties now, traitors and patriots."
No hedging, no hesitation, and his rise was meteoric, fueled by that lack of hesitation and his willingness to take decisive action.
After mustering troops in Illinois, he quickly moved from colonel to brigadier general, taking command in the Western Theater. And this is where he earns his defining reputation.
Our reputation forged in 1862 with the capture of Forts Henry and Donelson, which were these strategically vital Confederate strongholds protecting the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers.
Right, they were the gateway deep into the South.
Fort Henry fell pretty quickly to naval gunboats. Fort Donelson, though, that was a major confrontation.
The Confederate forces tried to break out but were repulsed, leading their senior generals, John D. Floyd and Gideon Pillow, to literally flee the field. They just abandoned their men.
And left command to General Simon Bolivar Buckner.
Buckner, facing a desperate situation, asked Grant for terms of surrender. And Grant's famous reply was just so blunt and absolute.
"No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works."
Boom. That non-negotiable demand secured the Union's first major, overwhelming victory, capturing over 12,000 Confederate troops.
And the Northern press immediately seized upon his initials, dubbing him Unconditional Surrender Grant. It gave the North a desperately needed hero.
But immediately following this victory, Grant ran straight into the crucible that would test his leadership and cement his strategy. The Battle of Shiloh in April 1862.
His troops were at Pittsburgh Landing, preparing for a major offensive, when the Confederates, led by Albert Sidney Johnston, launched a massive surprise attack.
It was chaos. The Union lines just broke under the weight of what Grant described as an alpine avalanche.
The first day was a total disaster. Thousands of Union troops were fleeing, but Grant, despite being heavily criticized for not anticipating the attack, refused to retreat.
He reorganized the lines overnight and, with reinforcements, launched a massive counterattack that won the second day.
But the cost was just staggering. 23,746 casualties. It was the bloodiest battle in U.S. history up to that point. The victory was his, but the Northern press turned on him ruthlessly.
Yeah, they revived the old accusations of drinking, demanded his removal.
And this is where we get Lincoln's legendary defense. When his cabinet members urged him to replace Grant, Lincoln replied,
"I can't spare this man. He fights."
Exactly. It was a recognition that Grant, unlike McClellan, understood the true nature of this war.
And Shiloh profoundly changed Grant's own thinking. He realized the South wasn't fighting a limited war for concessions. They were fighting for absolute independence.
He wrote that the battle ended any illusions of a quick victory and convinced him that the war could only be won by complete conquest.
The absolute destruction of the Confederacy's ability and will to fight.
That aggressive, total war mindset is what fueled his next major objective, the Vicksburg Campaign in 1863.
Vicksburg was the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. Capturing it would split the Confederacy and secure the entire river for the Union.
This campaign is often cited as the epitome of Grant's military genius because it just threw out the established playbook. To bypass the powerful Confederate guns at Vicksburg, he marched his army south on the Louisiana side of the river,
While Admiral Porter ran his gunboats past the city. But once they were across the river to the east, Grant's army was cut off from its traditional supply lines.
And this is where his education as a quartermaster during the Mexican War became invaluable. He made the radical decision to abandon his supply lines entirely and just subsist off the land, foraging.
This was nearly unheard of for a major army. It allowed him unprecedented speed and maneuverability. Lee, for instance, could never achieve that level of freedom in the East because he was always tied to his supply wagons.
Grant's army was able to defeat Confederate forces in a series of key battles, including Champion Hill, and marched straight into a siege of Vicksburg, which surrendered on July 4, 1863. A strategic masterpiece.
It was. However, during this campaign, we have to address the most profound dark spot on his military record: the issuance of General Order No. 11 on December 17, 1862.
Right. Amidst complaints about widespread speculation and illicit cotton trading, some of which did involve Jewish merchants, Grant issued an order expelling Jews as a class from his military district.
It was a horrific blanket order based on anti-Semitic scapegoating. When the issue reached Washington, Lincoln immediately rescinded the order on January 3, 1863.
Grant later called it one of the most regrettable acts of his life.
And it's crucial to note that he spent much of his later career trying to make amends. During his presidency, he actively appointed over 50 Jewish people to federal offices, including powerful posts demonstrating a profound commitment to reconciliation after that massive mistake.
While that controversy was raging, Grant also demonstrated his pragmatic humanity toward freed slaves. As his army moved, thousands of fugitive African Americans poured into his camps.
He established these contraband camps and organized the former slaves, incorporating them into the Union effort, using their labor to pick cotton that was shipped north. And he got Lincoln's enthusiastic approval for it.
By October 1863, after his victory at Chattanooga opened the way to Georgia, Lincoln promoted Grant to Major General in the regular army. And the following year, on March 6, 1864, the final promotion came.
Lieutenant General, a rank previously held only by George Washington. Grant was now General-in-Chief of all Union armies.
And his working relationship with Lincoln was immensely strong, mutually respectful. Lincoln finally had a general who not only fought, but understood the political necessity of coordinated, simultaneous action across all theaters.
Grant's grand strategy was designed for that complete conquest, coordinating 5 major offensives across the map, making sure Confederate forces couldn't reinforce each other.
He and Meade would directly engage Lee in Virginia, while Sherman would destroy Johnston's army and seize Atlanta. The war became this massive coordinated machine.
And this led to the brutal Overland Campaign of 1864. Grant's new philosophy was continuous, relentless pressure. He vowed to fight through to the end, even if it took all summer.
His forces suffered immense casualties, nearly 18,000 at the Wilderness. But unlike previous Union commanders, Grant did not retreat. He just flanked Lee and moved south, always trying to wedge his forces between Lee and Richmond.
The peak of this relentless, terrible strategy was the Battle of Cold Harbor in June 1864. Grant believed if he could break Lee's lines at this vital road hub, the war might end quickly.
But Lee's men had constructed these massive, reinforced entrenchments. Grant ordered a frontal assault against a heavily fortified position, leading to catastrophic losses.
12,000 to 14,000 Union casualties in less than an hour, triple the Confederate losses. The horrific scene led to a massive spike in anti-war sentiment in the North.
It's a key moment of reflection for Grant. He later wrote in his memoirs with genuine sorrow that he regretted that the last assault at Cold Harbor was ever made.
It shows that despite his unconditional surrender determination, he wasn't callous toward human life. He was just convinced of the strategic necessity of the move, even when it proved disastrous.
The Overland Campaign then transitioned into the 9-month siege of Petersburg. Grant was determined to deny Lee supplies, eventually capturing the vital railroad links.
And despite the stunning failure of the Battle of the Crater, a massive mine explosion that became a bloodbath due to poor leadership, the slow, grinding siege worked.
By March 1865, the Confederate logistical system had entirely collapsed. Lee was trapped, his army starving and deserting by the thousands. The end came swiftly.
Lee abandoned Petersburg and Richmond on April 2nd. Grant pursued, and on April 9, 1865, they met at Appomattox Courthouse.
And Grant's behavior here defined the post-war terms. He was compassionate and generous.
He offered terms that were essentially a national healing mechanism. Confederate soldiers and officers were paroled immediately, allowed to return home, not to be disturbed by U.S. authority.
And they were allowed to keep their personal property, crucially their horses, because they will need them for spring plowing.
Grant ordered his victorious troops to stop all celebration, saying simply, "The war is over, the rebels are our countrymen again." That generosity was critical.
It set the precedent that Civil War leaders would not be prosecuted for treason, a precedent Grant insisted upon when Andrew Johnson later attempted to try Lee.
And just 5 days later, the tragedy of Lincoln's assassination. Grant and Julia had declined the invitation to Ford's Theater, which spared Grant, who was almost certainly a target in the conspiracy.
Grant was genuinely grief-stricken, later describing Lincoln as the greatest man I have ever known. The transition to peace was instantly thrown into turmoil.
The shift from general to president really began with his complicated break from Andrew Johnson. As commanding general, Grant adamantly upheld the Appomattox Amnesty, opposing Johnson's immediate punitive demands to prosecute Lee.
Initially, Grant tried to work with Johnson, but Johnson's extremely lenient Reconstruction policies, which allowed former Confederates to quickly regain power, just appalled Grant. He privately called Johnson's public speeches a national disgrace.
The relationship broke entirely over the dismissal of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Johnson tried to fire Stanton, violating the recently passed Tenure of Office Act.
And for our listener, the Tenure of Office Act was a check on presidential power. It required the Senate's approval before the president could remove cabinet members. Johnson just defied it.
Grant briefly served as interim Secretary of War, but he resigned to avoid fines and a political clash with Congress. Johnson subsequently accused Grant of lying and duplicity about his intentions, which cemented a massive public break.
And that public feud made Grant a hero to the radical Republicans in Congress who were pushing for stronger protections for freedmen in the South. His nomination for president in 1868 was almost inevitable.
He accepted the nomination, believing he was the only one who could unify the fractured nation. And he campaigned on that simple, powerful slogan, "Let us have peace."
He won the election, but the analysis of the vote is fascinating. He actually received a minority of the white vote.
Right.
His victory was entirely dependent on the nearly 500,000 votes cast by newly enfranchised African Americans in the South. And despite the success, he lost Louisiana and Georgia due to widespread voter suppression and violence from groups like the Ku Klux Klan,
which absolutely galvanized his commitment to enforcement.
So Grant was sworn in 1869, and we have to analyze him first and foremost as a highly effective civil rights executive, whose actions were, nothing short of radical for the time.
They truly were. He understood the debt owed to black voters. He
Yeah.
strongly supported and signed the 15th Amendment, prohibiting states from denying the right to vote based on race.
And under his watch, the last three Confederate states, Mississippi, Virginia, and Texas, ratified it and were readmitted to Congress, completing the formal restoration of the Union.
But beyond the 15th Amendment, his most significant and often overlooked structural move was the creation of the Justice Department in 1870.
This was a revolutionary move. Until then, federal law enforcement was just haphazard. Grant created a dedicated centralized department, empowering the Attorney General to prosecute enemies of Reconstruction and enforce federal laws robustly across the states.
And he immediately gave the Justice Department the tools they needed. 3 enforcement acts passed between 1870 and 1871, often called the Ku Klux Klan Acts.
These acts targeted those who tried to deprive citizens of their rights or conspired to overthrow state governments.
And Grant used these laws with unprecedented force. By October 1871, he declared the situation in parts of South Carolina to be in a state of insurrection, suspended habeas corpus, and sent federal troops to aid U.S. Marshals and prosecutors.
His Attorney General, Amos T. Ackerman, and Solicitor General Benjamin Bristow arrested and prosecuted thousands of Klansmen. The federal court system convicted hundreds, forcing many Klansmen to flee the state entirely.
This aggressive, muscular use of federal power effectively crushed the Klan by 1872.
It's a monumental achievement that has been just sidelined by history. Grant used the power of the federal government to suppress domestic terrorism and secure the rights of his citizens, allowing African Americans to vote in record numbers in 1872.
It was a victory for civil rights that the nation would not see again for nearly a century.
And this political courage was immediately contrasted by major financial challenges, starting just 6 months into his presidency with the Gold Corner Conspiracy of 1869.
This was a sophisticated manipulation of the gold market orchestrated by the infamous railroad tycoons Jay Gould and Jim Fisk.
They wanted to drive up the price of gold dramatically, which would in turn drive up the price of agricultural exports, benefiting their Erie Railroad.
And to make the scheme work, they needed Grant to promise that the Treasury Department would not sell off its massive gold reserves, thereby limiting the supply.
They exploited Grant's lack of financial understanding and his trusting nature, building a close relationship with his wife's brother-in-law, Abel Corbin, who acted as a direct insider.
And they succeeded in driving the price of gold to astronomical levels. On Friday, September 24, known as Black Friday, the market was in a total panic.
When the price hit $143.18, Treasury Secretary George Boutwell, acting on Grant's direct order, Grant finally realized the full threat flooded the market by selling $4 million of government gold.
And the bull market instantly collapsed. The price plummeted from 160 to 133 in 13 minutes, wiping out countless small investors and triggering a bear market panic that caused economic damage for months.
Grant stopped the scheme and later survived a congressional investigation that cleared him of any wrongdoing, confirming he was a target of exploitation.
But the scandal established this narrative that he was easily influenced and surrounded by unsavory characters, a narrative that would haunt his entire presidency.
And the economic turmoil didn't end there. In his second term, the Panic of 1873 was triggered by the collapse of the major investment bank J. Cook and Company, ushering in the Long Depression.
This forced Grant to make a defining, yet politically risky decision regarding currency.
To understand this, we need to clarify a fundamental economic concept for our listener: the gold standard versus greenbacks.
Right. The country had two types of money. The gold standard meant currency was backed by physical gold, providing stability and national credit. Greenbacks were paper currency issued during the Civil War, not backed by gold and thus inherently inflationary.
So when the Depression hit, many Western and Southern farmers, debtors, and Republicans who wanted to stimulate the economy favored inflation, meaning they wanted more greenbacks printed. This led Congress to pass the Inflationary Ferry Bill in 1874,
which would have added $64 million in greenbacks to circulation.
Grant, advised by conservative bankers and reformers, believed this inflationary policy would destroy the financial credit of the nation. Despite immense political pressure from his own party and the risk of losing the 1874 midterm elections, he vetoed the bill.
It was a massive statement of fiscal responsibility. It solidified the Republican Party's commitment to the gold standard, ensuring long-term national credit stability at the cost of immediate economic stimulus.
And it showed Grant acting decisively against his own political self-interest. He later followed this up by signing the Specie Payment Resumption Act in 1875, ensuring the eventual return to full gold-backed currency.
So now we have to confront the duality of his presidency. The towering success in civil rights and financial stability is constantly overshadowed by the administrative turmoil and corruption that plagued his administration.
We have to start by acknowledging Grant's fundamental personal integrity. Everyone, even his critics, described him as personally honest.
But he was also deeply trusting, maybe naive, and often displayed a crippling, excessive loyalty to old friends and military subordinates who proved to be deeply corrupt.
Post-Civil War, America was an age of massive speculation and corruption, and nearly all of Grant's departments faced congressional investigation.
Yet, alongside the corruption, we see Grant implementing structural reforms that were decades ahead of their time.
Exactly. He created the first Civil Service Commission in 1871, establishing competitive exams and merit-based classification for positions. He advanced civil service reform more than any prior president.
He also appointed proven reformers, notably Jacob D. Cox and later Zachariah Chandler in the Interior Department, who ruthlessly fired corrupt agents.
But his biggest anti-corruption success came through his appointment of Benjamin Bristow as Treasury Secretary. Bristow immediately launched an intense investigation that uncovered the notorious whiskey ring.
Which was a massive collusion scheme between distillers and Treasury officials.
And to explain this clearly for the listener, this wasn't simple graft. The whiskey ring was a complex network operating mainly in St. Louis, Milwaukee, and Chicago, where distillers intentionally evaded the federal excise tax on liquor.
They paid kickbacks to the Treasury officials who were supposed to be monitoring their output, allowing them to pocket millions of dollars that should have gone to the federal government.
Bristow struck hard and broke the ring, leading to 110 convictions and the recovery of millions in unpaid taxes, a massive win for integrity.
But it led directly to the worst scandal for Grant personally.
Because Bristow's investigation discovered that Grant's private secretary, Orville Babcock, a man Grant deeply trusted and who had served him faithfully during the war, had received kickback payments.
He even tipped off the ringleaders about the investigation.
This created an extraordinary loyalty dilemma. Grant famously wrote to his attorney general regarding the investigation, "Let no guilty man escape."
However, when Babcock was indicted, Grant's loyalty proved stronger than his judgment. He gave a deposition in defense of Babcock's character, declaring his confidence in his secretary was unshaken.
Babcock was ultimately acquitted by the St. Louis jury, but Grant's public defense severely eroded his credibility on the corruption issue, allowing his critics to claim he was protecting guilty men.
And though Grant eventually dismissed Babcock after he was implicated in a separate conspiracy, the damage was done.
And the list of scandals just continued. Secretary of War William W. Belknap was impeached in 1876 for taking quarterly kickbacks from trader ships at Indian posts. Even Grant's own brother, Orville, was involved in trading post corruption.
The cumulative effect just defined his image.
In his 1876 annual message to Congress, Grant offered this heartfelt apology to the nation, recognizing his failures of trust, stating, "Failures have been errors of judgment, not of intent."
Shifting focus, we have to examine foreign policy, where Grant, despite his limited experience, managed one of the most significant diplomatic successes of the 19th century under the guidance of his extremely capable Secretary of State, Hamilton Fish.
That success was the Treaty of Washington in 1871, which settled the Alabama claims against Great Britain.
To put this into context,
Yeah.
during the Civil War, Britain, despite official neutrality, allowed Confederate warships like the CSS Alabama to be built in their shipyards.
These ships severely damaged the Union merchant fleet. After the war, the U.S. sought reparations for this clear failure of British neutrality. The diplomatic tension was extremely high.
Grant and Fish agreed to an unprecedented move: arbitration by an international tribunal in Geneva. This decision secured peace with Great Britain, avoided potential warfare, and resulted in a successful $15.5 million settlement for the U.S.
It established a mechanism for peaceful international dispute resolution and turned Britain into America's closest international ally for the next century. A huge win.
A huge win. Yet this triumph was balanced by a major diplomatic failure: the proposed annexation of Santo Domingo, the Dominican Republic.
Grant, driven by this expansionist impulse and a desire to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, saw the annexation as a strategic necessity.
He also framed it as a humanitarian effort, arguing that acquiring the island would provide a safe haven for black people fleeing the terror of the Klan and white supremacist groups in the South. He called it an answer to the crime of Ku Kluxism.
But he was so zealous that he circumvented standard diplomatic channels and sent his military aide, Orville Babcock, to secure unauthorized annexation treaties. He then used intense pressure to force his cabinet to accept them.
However, the plan was fiercely opposed by the powerful chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Charles Sumner.
A renowned abolitionist and radical Republican, Sumner opposed it on anti-imperialist grounds, fearing the U.S. was imposing its will on a weak nation.
The Senate defeated the treaties. Grant, outraged by Sumner's opposition, retaliated by maneuvering to strip Sumner of his powerful Senate chairmanship.
This became a major political feud that destabilized Grant's relationship with the radical Republicans in Congress, who had been his strongest allies on Reconstruction.
We should also briefly mention the 1871 Korean expedition, which was sent to open trade and resulted in the Battle of Gangwon.
Militarily successful, but it ultimately failed to achieve its diplomatic goal of opening trade, adding a little footnote to his expansionist foreign policy.
And finally, let's look at his federal Indian policy, often known as the peace policy.
Grant's stated goal was fundamentally assimilationist. He sought to move Native Americans from tribal sovereignty to becoming individual citizens, encouraging them to adopt European customs and language.
He demonstrated good faith by appointing Eli S. Parker, and assimilated Seneca, who had served on his wartime staff, as the first Native American Commissioner of Indian Affairs.
To tackle the rampant corruption in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the very corruption that entangled Belknap and his own brother Grant established the unpaid Board of Indian Commissioners. This board aimed to replace profit-driven entrepreneurs with missionaries from various religious denominations.
But the policy was just riddled with contradictions that doomed it. The 1871 Indian Appropriations Act ended the sovereign tribal treaty system, effectively making Native Americans wards of the federal government, not nations.
And the contradiction became violently clear when gold was discovered in the Black Hills, sacred territory protected by treaty for the Sioux. White settlers trespassed immediately.
Grant, bowing to political pressure and the demands of the economic depression, decided not to enforce the exclusion of minors, essentially forcing Native Americans onto smaller reservations.
This betrayal directly contributed to the Great Sioux War, culminating tragically in the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876.
Grant openly castigated Custer in the press, blaming the massacre on Custer's recklessness. But despite over 200 battles fought during his presidency, the policy survived, ensuring Indian policy remained under the Interior Department rather than the War Department after he left office.
The accumulated effect of the scandals, the depression, and just the exhaustion of Northern political will led to a massive shift. The Democrats took control of the House in 1874, stripping Grant of his ability to fund and support Reconstruction efforts.
This is where we see the final tragic failure of Reconstruction. In the South, Redeemer Democrats, these white supremacist groups, formed armed organizations like the Red Shirts and the White League, using open violence and voter fraud to reclaim power.
Grant later regretted not issuing a proclamation to help Republican governors maintain order in states like Mississippi when the violence escalated, admitting the political support in the North had just evaporated.
He had crushed the Klan once, but the political will to sustain that enforcement was gone.
And when Grant left office in 1877, his final act concerning the South was heartbreaking. To resolve the disputed 1876 presidential election between Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden, Grant facilitated the peaceful compromise of 1877.
In short, the Republicans got the White House, but in exchange, the federal government agreed to immediately end the enforcement of racial equality and remove the last federal troops from the South.
It was the final nail in Reconstruction's coffin, ushering in 80 years of institutionalized Jim Crow segregation, completely reversing Grant's greatest achievement.
So Grant leaves office in 1877, famously proclaiming he was never so happy in my life.
Despite having no permanent home, he was not idle. He immediately embarked on this unprecedented 2.5-year global tour.
This journey, initially funded by liquidating a mining investment, made him the first president to circumnavigate the world. It was a massive unofficial diplomatic mission.
It was basically an attempt to introduce the United States as a major global power.
Absolutely. He met with Queen Victoria, Tsar Alexander II, Otto von Bismarck, Emperor Meiji. His reception was generally overwhelming, demonstrating a global respect for the man who won the Civil War.
When he finally returned to San Francisco, he was greeted by ecstatic, cheering crowds.
And his popularity spurred the third-term attempt in 1880, as the stalwart faction of the Republican Party rallied around him, arguing for a non-consecutive return to the White House.
At the convention, he had more delegates pledged to him than any other candidate. His old ally, Roscoe Conkling, delivered this electrifying nomination speech, declaring that when asked which state Grant hails from, our sole reply shall be, he hails from Appomattox and its famous apple tree.
But the party was fractured. After 36 ballots, Grant remained short of a majority, and the nomination eventually went to the compromise candidate, James A. Garfield.
And that ended Grant's political life for good.
After his political ambitions ended, he faced utter financial ruin, demonstrating yet again the stunning complexity of his life.
Yeah, it's important context that in the 19th century, there were no federal presidential pensions. Grant's income was limited.
So he invested heavily in a Wall Street brokerage house, Grant and Ward, run by his son Buck, and a brilliant but utterly conniving man named Ferdinand Ward.
Ward was a financial criminal running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme. He was rehypothecating the company's securities, essentially using the same assets as collateral for multiple fraudulent loans.
And Grant, who Ferdinand Ward himself later called a child in business matters, invested $100,000 of his own money. When the firm collapsed in May 1884, it triggered a market crash, the Panic of 1884.
Grant was left completely destitute. Wealthy businessman William Henry Vanderbilt, recognizing Grant's service, offered to forgive his $150,000 personal loan.
But Grant, driven by that profound personal honor that defined him, refused. He insisted on honoring his debts.
To try and repay what he could, he sold off everything he owned, including his cherished Civil War mementos. The national sympathy was overwhelming. Here's the man who saved the Union, brought down by a crook he foolishly trusted, refusing charity out of sheer principle.
Facing destitution and then diagnosed with throat cancer, likely caused by his relentless cigar smoking, Grant began a frantic race against time, writing his personal memoirs to secure his wife Julia's financial future.
Congress, in a rare show of bipartisan support, restored him to the rank of General of the Army with full retirement pay.
But the crucial intervention came from his friend, the author Mark Twain. Twain recognized the unfairness of Grant's previous publishing offers and offered him an unprecedented contract. A staggering 70% royalty, far superior to the industry standard 10%.
So Grant wrote intensely, often in terrible pain, completing the memoir just 4 days before his death on July 23, 1885.
The book was a phenomenal commercial and critical success, earning Julia about $450,000 in royalties, which is the equivalent of approximately $15.7 million today, securing her future just as he intended.
And the memoirs are regarded as a literary masterpiece, not just for their military insights, but for their honest, concise, and compelling prose, cementing his image as this honorable, reserved Western hero.
At his death, the national outpouring was tremendous. He was memorialized as a powerful symbol of unity. Tens of thousands marched in his funeral procession, and his pallbearers included both Union commanders like Sherman and Sheridan, and former Confederate leaders like Simon Bolivar Buckner and Joseph E. Johnston.
But that unity did not last. His reputation began to decline rapidly after his death, damaged heavily by the pervasive Lost Cause movement, which sought to mythologize Lee and the Confederacy.
Crucially, his historical standing was decimated by the early 20th century historians known as the Dunning School.
And for our listener, the Dunning School were academics who largely believed that Reconstruction was a failure precisely because it empowered African Americans, and they exaggerated the scandals of Grant's administration to condemn him for his robust enforcement of civil rights.
So Grant was marginalized for a century, viewed as an unsuccessful president and an unskilled general who simply relied on overwhelming force. The scandals completely overshadowed the radical political courage he showed against the Klan.
But the 21st century has brought a dramatic, necessary recovery. Modern scholarship has forcefully rehabilitated his image, emphasizing his personal integrity, his skill as a modern strategist who pioneered total warfare, and above all, his principled, forceful defense of African American civil rights during Reconstruction.
And the concrete proof is in the rankings. The C-SPAN survey ranking President saw Grant jump from 33rd all the way to 20th, indicating his recovered status as an effective, morally driven leader who is now finally receiving credit for his use of federal power to fight voter suppression and for his diplomatic successes.
So there you have it, Ulysses S. Grant. The quiet, sometimes failed civilian who became the Union's decisive commander and whose greatest victory, one that we are only now truly acknowledging, was securing basic rights for newly freed Americans against overwhelming political and domestic terrorist opposition.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought for you to mull over.
Grant led the Union to victory by pursuing complete conquest over the Confederate armies, demanding unconditional surrender. We know that when faced with the political and social warfare of Reconstruction, he eventually deferred to the loss of Northern political will in 1877.
So consider this. Had Grant been able to apply that same uncompromising, unconditional surrender resolve to the political enemies of Reconstruction, those who sought to dismantle the 15th Amendment and institute Jim Crow by maintaining a forceful federal presence indefinitely, even at the cost of national harmony, would the subsequent century of codified racial injustice in America have been avoided? It forces us to ask whether moral victories sometimes require political costs no democracy is willing to pay.